I don't know about you, but I find that confusing. There's a rich man who has hired a manager to help oversee parts of his business. The rich man hears that the manager has been misusing his position to the point of taking resources that are not his to take. So he confronts the manager, asks to see the paperwork, and to explain himself, because the rich man is seriously thinking about firing him. The manager panics. He quickly thinks about his options, recognizing that manual labor would be too hard and that he didn't want to have to beg for money. And then he has an idea. He's going to cook the books, giving favors to those who owe his employer money by reducing the amount they owe, so that he might make friends with them and perhaps even receive help from them after he is no longer employed. Well, so far, I understand this. In fact, we could probably pick up a newspaper today and find a story similar, only with money, not olive oil and wheat. But when we go on, there's an interesting twist. The rich employer sees the manager in a new light. He's shrewd, and apparently that's something the rich man appreciates. He commends the manager. We don't know, but maybe he doesn't even fire him after all. But what's confusing, surprising, and hard to understand is the response Jesus gives when he goes on. Jesus notes that the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And then he says, to make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. What on earth does this mean? The lectionary for the daily office this past week included readings from the Beatitudes, but I do not recall reading, "Blessed are the shrewd, for they shall live in eternal homes gained by means of dishonest wealth." Now, there appears to be scholarly consensus that this parable is hard to understand. And while I found that validating, it wasn't particularly helpful. What was a help were some of the comments made by Amy Jill Levine, a Jewish New Testament scholar, in the introduction to her book about parables titled Short Stories by Jesus. And by the way, she didn't tackle this parable. But she says, what makes the parables mysterious or difficult is that they challenge us to look into the hidden aspects of our own values, our own lives. She goes on to say that parables are designed to surprise, to challenge, to provoke us, that they may have multiple layers and multiple meanings. They're supposed to be disturbing and provocative and lead to changes in us. As I sat with this parable, I thought about what it was saying to us today in the 21st century. And I've actually come to believe that there's more than one sermon in this parable. There's actually a good reflection in the section of our e-blast this week that reviews today's scripture. And it looks at this parable from the point of debt in third world countries, fair trade, fair wages. And I encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't had time yet. But this morning, let's look at it from a different angle. The main character in this parable seems to be the manager. We know what his employer has been told about his actions. Luke gives us a window into some of his thinking, and we're given a description of his behavior. With this information, take a minute to think about how you would describe this man to someone who has not heard the story. What words would you use to describe his character? What is he like as a person? Would you want him as a friend? Would you trust him? Hold on to that assessment as we explore some options. Early in the parable, it says, charges were brought to him, the employer, that this man was squandering his property. Now, Luke was written in Greek, and the Greek word that has been translated as charges were brought could also be translated as slander, suggesting the possibility that the charges were not true. What difference would it make if these charges were in fact false? What if we found out that the reason this man could not do physical labor was because of advanced age or a physical disability? What if he didn't want to beg, a task that could have taken every waking minute, because he needed to be more flexible in his schedule to care for aging parents, to help his children, or because he spent some of his time each day helping a widow who lived next door? What if some of the debts he reduced belonged to poor people who worked hard but were vulnerable and could not get ahead? What if he remained loyal to his employer and part of his motivation was to make his boss look good to those whose debts were reduced? What if we looked at the reduction of debt as a demonstration of forgiveness? The point is, we don't know everything about this man or the situation, do we? We only know a few of his thoughts from a time when he was in crisis. And yet my first impression of this man was negative. And I would guess the same for some of you. We're living in a time where there is so much labeling and divisiveness, where we can identify ourselves and others with a few one-word descriptions, and often there is an assumption of good or bad to go along with those single words. And yet our world is not simple, is it? There are very few problems that have a simple solution. There are very few challenges in our time that have a straightforward, quick, and easy fix. And there are very few people that can be accurately described in one or two words. We are placed in situations where we feel obligated to form opinions without fully understanding the history, the science, the culture, or other factors involved. And it's too easy to become locked into that opinion without being open to hearing new or contradicting information, or even changing our mind. And maybe that is a clue to what it is meant when Jesus seems to talk about being shrewd as a positive thing. Perhaps he's suggesting that ingenuity, street smarts, thinking outside the box, and even taking risks can be Christian virtues, especially when it's done to serve others. In another gospel, Jesus told his disciples, "See, I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents." And maybe it's a reminder to us that we need to do more to understand people and situations at a deeper and more complete level, using critical thinking, listening to different points of view, being open to changing our mind, and reminding ourselves that no matter how hard we try, we may never see the whole picture. Now, this is also a story about wealth, power, status, and prestige being fleeting and temporary. In the moments of a short interaction with his employer, the manager was about to lose all these things. So what did he do? He forgave debt. He met with people that up until now probably had no wealth, power, status, or prestige, and he did something good for them. He began the process of tearing down artificial boundaries. He began investing in relationships. These are the things that last. And now this is beginning to sound more like Jesus' teaching, isn't it? I've barely scratched the surface. of this rich parable. We've looked at our need as Christians to use our minds, to seek understanding and wisdom, to focus on what is lasting. Is it also about money and the use of resources? It is. Is it about forgiveness? I think so. Is it about relieving the burdens on the poor? Yes. It is most definitely about complex situations, imperfect people, and not having easy answers. But this parable is also about grace. It's about us being much more than the mistakes or bad choices we've made. It's about our being God's beloved children. It's about Christ seeing the good in us, even though we're imperfect. It's about the gift of grace that defies logic. And that seems to be too good to be true, but it is. We are the recipients of the gift of God's grace.